The history of land ownership in Canada is deeply intertwined with colonial practices that led to the dispossession of Indigenous peoples, particularly concerning agricultural lands. Settler colonialism facilitated the transfer of vast tracts of fertile land from First Nations to settlers, often through coercive treaties and policies that disregarded Indigenous sovereignty. This essay examines the mechanisms of land dispossession, the role of treaties, and the ongoing implications for First Nations communities. Historical context of land dispossession. The colonization of Canada involved the systematic appropriation of Indigenous lands. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 acknowledged Indigenous land rights but was frequently ignored in practice, leading to widespread dispossession, durance legal, ND. Settlers viewed land as a commodity, contrasting with Indigenous perspectives that saw land as integral to community and survival. Open Library Publishing Platform, ND. Treaties and broken promises. Many treaties were signed under duress or through misleading negotiations, resulting in the cession of vast territories. These agreements often promised support for agriculture and self-sufficiency, commitments that were rarely fulfilled, powwow times, and the failure to honor treaty obligations contributed to the marginalization of Indigenous communities and the erosion of their agricultural practices. Settler land ownership and economic disparities. Settlers benefited from policies like the Dominion Lands Act, acquiring land at minimal cost, which facilitated wealth accumulation through agriculture. In contrast, First Nations were confined to reserves with limited resources, hindering their economic development, Canada's history, ND. The disparity in land ownership rights has had lasting effects on the economic well-being of Indigenous populations. Contemporary implications and land claims. Today, many First Nations are engaged in legal battles to reclaim traditional lands or seek compensation. The Assembly of First Nations advocates for the recognition of inherent land rights and the resolution of land claims, Assembly of First Nations, ND. Despite these efforts, the process remains fraught with challenges, including bureaucratic hurdles and political resistance. Conclusion. The dispossession of First Nations farmland in Canada is a legacy of colonial policies that prioritize settler interests over Indigenous rights. Addressing this historical injustice requires honoring treaty commitments, recognizing Indigenous land rights, and supporting the economic revitalization of First Nations communities. Why it's not so simple for First Nations to just buy the land back. The notion that Indigenous peoples should simply purchase land that was historically taken from them overlooks a complex web of historical injustices, legal constraints, and systemic barriers. 1. Historical dispossession. Much of the land in Canada was never willingly ceded by Indigenous peoples. Instead, it was acquired through treaties that were often misunderstood, misrepresented, or outright violated. In some cases, land was taken without any treaty at all. For instance, the Bigtigong-Nishnabeg, Pick River First Nation, asserts they never signed the 1850 Robinson-Superior Treaty, yet their lands were appropriated. 2. Legal and financial constraints. Under the Indian Act, reserve lands are held in trust by the Crown, meaning First Nations cannot leverage these lands as collateral for loans. This restriction severely limits their ability to secure financing for land purchases. Additionally, the Indian Act historically prohibited First Nations from owning land off reserve, further complicating efforts to acquire property in urban areas. Data 3. Systemic underfunding. Indigenous communities have faced chronic underfunding in areas like housing, education, and infrastructure. This financial disparity hampers their capacity to invest in land acquisition. A report by the Yellowhead Institute highlights how systemic impoverishment, rooted in colonial policies, continues to affect First Nations. 4. Urban housing challenges. Indigenous peoples seeking housing in urban centers encounter numerous obstacles. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, acknowledges that Indigenous households are disproportionately represented among those in core housing need, with 1/3 of Indigenous renters affected. Furthermore, existing housing programs often fail to address the unique needs of Indigenous populations in urban settings. 5. Jurisdictional complexities. Even when First Nations attempt to manage their lands independently, they face bureaucratic hurdles. The Framework Agreement on First Nation Land Management, allows communities to opt out of certain Indian Act provisions, but the transition process is complex and resource intensive.